You ever get a text that quietly ruins your entire world? I did. On a Tuesday morning, while watering the hydrangeas my late husband and I planted decades ago. My daughter, Rachel, wrote, "It's best if you don't come to the wedding. It'll just make things awkward with Andrew's family. Hope you understand." Hope I understand? I raised her by myself, worked 3 jobs, skipped my own dreams so she could chase hers, and now I was inconvenient. Not uninvited from a party, but erased from her life for the sake of appearance. But I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I canceled the check for the venue, and I booked a 6-month world cruise, leaving the day before her wedding. They wanted a perfect day without me. What they got was a disaster no one would forget. If you've ever been discarded by your own family, stay with me. Because this isn't a revenge story, it's a resurrection. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the wooden floorboards of the kitchen. Margaret Willis stood by the window, a warm mug of chamomile tea in her hand, watching a robin hop across the garden path. It was a quiet life, too quiet, some might say. But she had grown into it like the ivy on her brick wall, slow, steady, and rooted. Her house, a modest colonial built in the 50s, held more than just furniture. Every corner whispered a memory. The sofa still bore the faint impression of her late husband Thomas's favorite seat. The scuffed kitchen counter had been Rachel's workstation during endless science projects. The smell of lavender, always lingering, was a scent Thomas loved and she'd never replaced. It wasn't just a home, it was a timeline, layered with laughter, sacrifice, and 1,000 invisible acts of love. After Thomas passed away 2 decades ago, Margaret became the anchor of their small 2-person world. She balanced grief with motherhood, folding her sorrow into each packed lunch, every signed permission slip, each late-night fever vigil. Rachel had been her world, and Margaret had poured herself into raising a kind, capable, confident woman. She never remarried, never traveled, never once entertained the idea of chasing her own dreams. Her dream had always been Rachel. Even now, as Rachel's wedding approached, Margaret remained the invisible force behind the scenes. She had coordinated the venue, negotiated contracts, and soothed over vendor miscommunications, all while Rachel juggled work calls and designer fittings. Margaret took it as a gift to still be needed, even if it wasn't spoken out loud. A stack of neatly labeled folders sat on the kitchen table, wedding arrangements meticulously organized, catering, flowers, music, transportation. The final payment for the venue, Northgate Manor, an estate more palace than hall, was due at the end of the week. $50,000. She had the check already written, tucked between the pages of the venue folder. She didn't flinch at the amount. It was from the savings Thomas left her. He would have wanted this, she told herself. He adored Rachel. Margaret looked around the house. Everything she had ever done was for her daughter, and now, standing in this quiet kitchen, she allowed herself a small, contented smile. She believed, truly believed, that love like this would always be returned, that Rachel saw, that she remembered, that when the big day came, Margaret would be there, even if in the shadows. It wasn't about being honored, it was about being present. That was enough. Or so she thought. Later that afternoon, Margaret stood in the guest bedroom that had become her unofficial wedding command center. Bolts of ivory fabric lay draped over a chair. Swatches for napkins and table linens were pinned neatly to a corkboard. A whiteboard hung on the wall, covered in hand-drawn timelines, color-coded tasks, and call reminders. She smiled faintly at her own handwriting, still meticulous after decades of teaching second graders. She was ironing Rachel's rehearsal dinner dress, a simple but elegant blush pink gown Rachel had selected with her usual quick, decisive style. Margaret had suggested a softer lavender, but Rachel dismissed it politely. "Blush is more editorial," she said, not unkindly but firm. Margaret didn't mind. She never did. She'd learned long ago to support rather than steer. Just as she set the iron down, her phone buzzed. It was Rachel. "Hey, Mom," came the bright, distracted voice on speaker. "Quick favor, Andrew's mom wants to meet at the venue tomorrow to go over some of the design stuff. Can you come too? You know the layout better than anyone." Margaret blinked. "Of course, honey. What time?" 3-ish. "She's just got a lot of opinions, and I thought maybe if you were there, you could, translate a bit." Translate? The word hung in the air like a speck of dust in sunlight. Rachel didn't mean it cruelly, but it landed heavy. Claudia Langley had always made her presence felt, a woman who carried herself with the precision of a CEO and the warmth of an audit. Margaret had met her twice. Both times, Claudia had looked at her as one might examine a neighbor's landscaping. Polite, mildly curious, ultimately dismissive. Still, Margaret said yes, of course she did, because it was for Rachel, because she wanted to be part of this, even if that meant playing the quiet translator between two women from different worlds. The next day, Margaret arrived early. She walked the manicured paths of Northgate Manor, marveling at the roses in bloom, the symmetry of the fountains, the towering oaks casting long shadows on the cobblestone walkways. It was beautiful, breathtaking even, the kind of place you chose when you wanted to prove something. Claudia arrived 20 minutes late in a black luxury SUV, stepped out in heels that clicked with authority, and greeted Margaret with a nod that felt more like a favor than a courtesy. They walked the venue together. Claudia spoke in clipped tones. "The drapes are too dated. The dance floor feels cramped. Is the lighting adjustable?" Margaret tried to offer solutions, but each suggestion was met with a raised brow or a sharp, dismissive smile. "She really does depend on you," Claudia finally said near the end of the tour. "Rachel, you've handled everything." Her voice softened, almost approving. Margaret flushed. "I'm just happy to help." Claudia turned to her fully. "Yes, that's what mothers are for, isn't it?" Margaret stood still for a moment after Claudia's parting words, unsure whether it was a compliment or a conclusion. "That's what mothers are for." The phrase echoed inside her, not unkind, but hollow, like something carved from politeness, not respect. Claudia had left immediately after, escorted back to her SUV by the venue's event manager, without even a glance back at Margaret. She remained behind, lingering in the empty ballroom, watching sunlight filter through stained glass windows onto the polished wood floor. In a few weeks, Rachel would walk this aisle. Guests would applaud, vows would be exchanged, and Margaret, if she were lucky, would be somewhere discreet, out of sight but present. She didn't need the spotlight. She had never been that kind of woman. But something about the way Claudia had said it, "That's what mothers are for," felt like the closing of a door, not appreciation, expectation, obligation, a tidy little box labeled mom, expected to remain silent and useful inside. Back home, Margaret sat in her garden, the sun low on the horizon, her hands absent-mindedly tugging at weeds. The hydrangeas were blooming, a sea of blue and lavender swaying gently in the breeze. She had planted them with Thomas after Rachel was born. "Let's fill the world with color for her," he had said. And they had. Every spring since, they bloomed faithfully, no matter what. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached for her phone. A new email from Rachel blinked on the screen. Updated guest list plus seating chart. She opened the attachment. Page after page of names, table numbers, meal choices. She skimmed until she found hers, table 12. Not table 1 with immediate family, not table 2 with extended. Table 12 near the back. No familiar names surrounding her, no explanation. Her throat tightened. A second file followed. Program order plus ceremony notes. She clicked. Mother of the bride, no listed role. Her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't surprised. Not really. Rachel had been slowly redrawing the lines for months, years perhaps. The farther she climbed in her career, the more polished her life became, the more Margaret was trimmed from the edges like a loose thread. Not maliciously, just quietly. She closed the files and stared into the garden. The robin had returned, perched on the same branch, chirping a song it had sung for generations. Margaret felt something stir inside her. Not anger, not yet. Just a quiet, aching grief, the kind that seeps in through the cracks unnoticed until you're soaked. She wasn't being erased. She was being edited. That night, sleep came late, and restlessly. Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind running through an endless inventory of invisible contributions. The mornings she made Rachel's lunch in between grading papers, the nights she sat beside her sickbed, whispering lullabies, the weekends spent selling handmade candles at local fairs just to make a bit extra for college savings. None of it grand, all of it essential. And now, in the most important moment of Rachel's adult life, Margaret's presence was being gently repositioned to the margins, like a faded photo placed at the end of an album, there for sentiment, not significance. The next morning, she opened the venue folder again, double-checking the due date on the final payment. 3 days left. The check was still there, $50,000. She picked it up, stared at her own handwriting. It wasn't just ink on paper, it was the last large piece of security Thomas had left for her, a token of their years of shared dreams, a promise to herself that she would be cared for in her later years, a future. And she was about to sign it away for a seat at table 12. Later that day, Margaret met Rachel at a boutique to finalize dress alterations. Rachel emerged from the fitting room in a sleek, minimalist gown, all clean lines and elegance. "What do you think?" she asked, spinning slowly. Margaret smiled, genuinely. "You look beautiful, sweetheart." Rachel grinned, stepping forward to adjust a strap in the mirror. "It's perfect, right? Claudia thinks it's very vogue." Margaret's smile didn't falter, but inside, something twisted. "You know," Rachel continued, "Claudia offered to handle the honeymoon arrangements too. First class, overwater bungalow, private chef. She's just been so incredible." "Incredible?" Margaret echoed softly. Rachel didn't notice the edge. "It's just nice to have someone who understands this world, you know? High expectations, big visions. I used to think you had to do everything yourself. But sometimes, leaning on the right people, that's the smart move." Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, sometimes." She didn't argue. She didn't remind Rachel of who had booked the venue, negotiated with the florist, handled every detail. She didn't need to. She knew. But for the first time, something inside Margaret began to loosen. Not her love, never that, but her certainty, the idea that love and effort naturally translated into acknowledgement, into inclusion. As Rachel disappeared back into the fitting room, chattering to the tailor, Margaret looked at her reflection in the mirror across the room. Her face was lined, her eyes tired but clear. She saw not just a mother, but a woman who had quietly built everything around her. And just for a moment, she wondered, what would it feel like to choose herself for once? It was a Tuesday morning when the text came. Margaret was kneeling in her garden, trimming the lavender bushes that lined the back fence. The air smelled of sun-warmed earth and rosemary. Her gloves were dirt-stained, her mind halfway between nostalgia and tomorrow's to-do list. The wedding was 2 weeks away. She still had to finalize the cake delivery and confirm the quartet's arrival time. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her apron. She pulled off one glove, brushed her hands on a cloth, and retrieved it. The screen lit up with Rachel's name. "Hi, Mom. Mark and I have been talking, and we think it's best if you don't come to the wedding. His family will be there, and we just don't want any tension. I hope you understand. We'll send you pictures." For a long moment, everything went quiet. The birdsong faded. The breeze stilled. Even the lavender seemed to stop swaying. Margaret stared at the message, rereading it as if it might change. "I hope you understand." 4 words that carried the weight of finality, not a request, a command. There was no, "Can we talk about this?" No, "Let's figure it out." It was done, decided, delivered with surgical detachment. She sank onto the stone bench beneath the oak tree, phone still in hand, feeling as if the sun had vanished behind a cloud. Her breath came slow and shallow, not with rage, not yet, just shock. Pure, clean disbelief. How had it come to this? She thought back to all the times she'd bent over backward to make things smooth. All of the times she'd bit her tongue when Claudia made a cutting remark, when Andrew's tone dripped with condescension, when Rachel casually dismissed her suggestions with a wave of the hand. She had stayed silent through it all. for Rachel's happiness. But now, silence had become her exile. She didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be twisted into the very drama Rachel claimed to want to avoid. Pleading would only confirm their narrative. Anger would brand her as petty. So she sat among the lavender and rosemary and let the silence stretch. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A lawnmower hummed to life. The world moved forward, indifferent to the tiny implosion in Margaret's chest. She read the message one last time. Then she placed the phone face down on the bench beside her, took a deep breath, and looked up at the sky. Not angry, not broken, just untethered. That evening, Margaret sat alone at the dining table, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her teacup. The room was dim, lit only by the golden spill of a floor lamp and the last rays of sun slanting through the window. The air was heavy with unspoken words. She hadn't told anyone, not her neighbor Anne, who often came by for coffee, not her sister June, who called every Sunday. There was something too raw, too shameful about being discarded by your own child, especially when you couldn't point to a single dramatic argument, a screaming match, a betrayal, just a message, just erasure. On the table before her sat the wedding folder. It felt heavier than usual, as if it now carried the weight of insult as well as logistics. She opened it slowly, each tab a reminder of her labor. Florals, seating chart, vows, and finally, venue. She flipped to the back where the check still sat, pristine and signed for $50,000. Due Friday, 3 days from now. She stared at the paper, her eyes drawn to the signature. Margaret Willis. The wedding would not happen without it. The venue was the heart of the event. Everything else revolved around it. And here she was, holding the one string that could unravel the entire production. She didn't feel spiteful. Not exactly. What she felt was clarity. For months, maybe even years, she'd convinced herself that Rachel's growing distance was temporary, that adulthood, career, and marriage were just phases pulling her daughter away. But this was deliberate. A line in the sand. They had uninvited her from the wedding. Why then should she fund it? Her hands moved with surprising steadiness. She pulled the check from its sleeve, folded it once, then again. The sound was crisp, final. Then she tore it straight down the middle and again until it was in 4 pieces lying like confetti in the waste bin. She sat back. No rage, no satisfaction either, just peace. She wasn't punishing Rachel. She was responding. They had made a choice. Now so had she. Outside, the garden glowed in the twilight. The hydrangeas rustled gently, oblivious. Margaret rose, walked to the window, and stood there for a long while, watching the sky darken. A new thought crept in, subtle and slow. What now? If not the wedding, then what? And that's when the idea came, soft at first, like a whisper, then clearer. Not revenge, escape. Something that was hers. The next morning, Margaret rose with an unfamiliar sense of intention. The garden didn't call to her. The house felt quieter than usual, not in a sad way, but in a way that gave her space to think, to breathe. She got dressed, choosing a light blue blouse Thomas had always said brought out the color in her eyes. It had been years since she wore it, years since she'd chosen anything for herself that wasn't based on practicality or someone else's need. She added a pair of pearl earrings, small, understated, elegant. Then she got in the car. She didn't call ahead. She didn't make a list. She just drove. It was a 20-minute ride to the edge of town, where a little travel agency sat tucked between a hardware store and a bakery. She'd passed it 1,000 times and never once gone in. It looked old-fashioned, almost quaint, with faded postcards in the window and a globe that spun gently on a wooden shelf. A bell jingled as she stepped inside. A woman in her early 40s looked up from behind the desk. She wore a scarf in her hair and reading glasses perched at the edge of her nose. Her name tag read Sarah. "Good morning," Sarah said brightly. "How can I help you?" Margaret hesitated, then walked forward with a confidence she didn't expect. "I want to book a trip," she said. Sarah smiled. Great! Do you know where you want to go? Yes, Margaret said, then paused. Everywhere. There was a beat of silence, and then Sarah laughed. Not mockingly, but with genuine delight. I love that answer. Let's start dreaming. For the next 2 hours, they mapped out a route, a 6-month journey that would begin in New York and stretch across the world. A transatlantic crossing to Lisbon, a Mediterranean leg through Italy and Greece, passage through the Suez Canal into Egypt, down the coast of Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, across the Pacific, South America, back home. Margaret felt like a traveler in her own life story. They discussed dates. She chose June 14th. Sarah tilted her head. That's very specific. Margaret smiled. Just seems like a good day to leave. She didn't explain that June 15th was Rachel's wedding. She didn't need to. Sarah started calculating costs. Margaret handed over the information for a cashier's check, drawn from the very same account that was once meant for the wedding. The irony tasted sharp but clean. When the booking was finalized, Sarah handed her a thick envelope with the itinerary, confirmation codes, and a small leather-bound travel journal. For notes or sketches or thoughts along the way, she said. Margaret took it gently, her fingers grazing the cover. She had just traded a place in the background of someone else's story for the starring role in her own, and for the first time in years, she couldn't wait to see what happened next. In the days that followed, Margaret moved with a quiet purpose. While the rest of the town buzzed in anticipation of the Willis-Davenport wedding, the event of the season, some said, she prepared for something far more personal, her own rebirth. She didn't tell Rachel. She didn't respond to the original message either. Silence was her answer, and in that silence she found a strange sort of power. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't chasing closeness, wasn't asking to be seen. She was simply stepping out of view by choice. She called her neighbor Anne to arrange care for the garden. She gave power of attorney to her lawyer for any home-related issues while she traveled. She donated 3 boxes of old clothes and unearthed a dusty suitcase from the attic, one she and Thomas had once used for their honeymoon. The zippers still worked. She took that as a sign. Each day, she packed a little more. Sun hats and hiking boots, linen dresses, and a waterproof windbreaker. A guidebook on Morocco, another on New Zealand. A camera she hadn't touched since Thomas passed away. As she zipped and folded, her mind wandered not to Rachel's upcoming wedding, but to the vibrant chaos of a street market in Bangkok, the cool mist over Norwegian fjords, the scent of eucalyptus in the Australian outback. One evening, while sipping tea by the window, she received an automated email from the wedding florist asking to confirm delivery to Northgate Manor. She clicked unsubscribe without hesitation. No panic, no bitterness, just detachment. Meanwhile, the silence from Rachel's end continued. No apologies, no updates. Margaret suspected her daughter had interpreted the lack of response as passive acceptance, one more quiet sacrifice from a mother too meek to challenge her. She likely assumed the check was in the mail. Margaret didn't care. She wasn't mailing a check. She was mailing herself across the globe. On the eve of her departure, she stood in the center of her living room with her bags packed and the itinerary neatly tucked inside her travel journal. The house looked as it always did, but something inside her had shifted entirely. She wasn't angry anymore. She didn't even feel betrayed. She felt free. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she whispered into the empty room, "Goodbye, Thomas. I'm finally doing it, for both of us." Then she turned out the lights, went upstairs, and slept more peacefully than she had in years. June 14th arrived bathed in golden light, the kind of summer morning that promised perfection. Margaret's taxi arrived promptly at noon, the driver cheerfully loading her bags into the trunk as she locked the front door one final time. She glanced at the hydrangeas swaying in the breeze, purple, blue, a few still blushing white. For a fleeting second, her chest tightened, not from doubt, from memory. She kissed her fingers and pressed them to the gatepost, then slid into the back seat. "Airport, please," she said, her voice calm, firm. The ride to New York was smooth. She watched familiar fields blur into city skylines, her thoughts wandering not to Rachel, but to the ship waiting at the docks, a floating world she would call home for the next 6 months. The idea of it still felt surreal, like something someone bolder would do, and yet here she was, doing it. At the port, the ship loomed like a palace, sleek and glistening under the sun. Passengers bustled around, a collage of accents and laughter and wheeled luggage. Margaret checked in, received her keycard, and boarded with the slow wonder of someone entering a cathedral. Her cabin was modest but warm, a balcony with an ocean view, a plush bed, polished wood panels. On the desk sat a welcome note. "Ms. Willis, may your journey be as expansive as your heart. The Voyager team." She unpacked slowly, placing Thomas's photo on the bedside table, her journal on the dresser, and the travel books in a neat stack. By 5 p.m., she stood on the top deck, champagne in hand, the Manhattan skyline framed behind her like a painting. Then her phone rang, unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something told her she already knew who it was. She picked up. "Hello? Mom?" Rachel's voice was high, strained. "What is going on?" Margaret said nothing. "I just got off the phone with the venue. They said the final payment never arrived. Patricia said she called you this morning, and you told her you weren't involved anymore. Is this some kind of mistake? A misunderstanding?" Margaret took a slow sip of champagne. "No mistake." Rachel's voice cracked. "Mom, the wedding is tomorrow. Everything is planned. 200 guests, vendors, press. We don't have that kind of money ready. What are you doing?" Margaret didn't flinch. "You uninvited me. So I assumed my contributions were no longer welcome either." The silence on the other end was sharp, like glass fracturing. "You can't be serious," Rachel whispered. "You're ruining everything." "No, darling," Margaret said softly. "I'm just no longer paying to be forgotten." On the other end of the line, Rachel's breathing grew uneven. Margaret could hear voices in the background, sharp, hurried, frantic. One of them was Claudia's, unmistakable in its clipped elegance. What, Claudia snapped. "Let me speak to her. Give me the phone." Margaret could almost see the flurry of panic, the expensive hair, the finger pointing, the emails flying. Rachel came back on the line, her tone no longer confused, but tight with accusation. "This isn't you. You're being cruel." "No, Rachel," Margaret said gently. "I'm being clear. You said you'd handle the venue. I said I'd help with your wedding," Margaret interrupted, her voice unwavering. "And then you made it clear I wasn't welcome at it, so I assumed that meant my help and my check weren't either." "You're punishing me." "I'm responding to the rules you set." There was a pause, then a shift. "You have to understand," Rachel said, her voice softening into a pleading tone. "It wasn't personal. We just didn't want any awkwardness. Mark's family is very particular, and you know how Emily is. We didn't want drama." Margaret's heart clenched. "Rachel, I've swallowed their disdain for years. I smiled when they called my house quaint. I bit my tongue when Mark explained my own pension plan to me like I was a child. I even let Claudia suggest table linens, like she was funding the wedding herself. And I did it all for you, to be part of your day. Quietly, kindly, completely." Another silence. "I didn't want to hurt you," Rachel said, but the words were limp, too late. Margaret sighed. "I know, you just didn't want me." Rachel's composure cracked. "What do you expect me to do now? We can't just conjure up $50,000. "I expect you to find a solution the way I always did when you needed something." Then Margaret did something she hadn't done in decades. She hung up first. She turned off the phone, slid it into her purse, and walked to the rail. The ship's horn bellowed in the distance. All around her, people cheered and waved as the vessel began to move. The city slowly receded, skyline turning to horizon. She took another sip of champagne, letting the sea air fill her lungs. Behind her was the ghost of a wedding that would never be what it promised. Ahead of her, a world waiting to be discovered. Rachel had chosen her image. Margaret had chosen her freedom. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, shimmering under the late afternoon sun. Margaret leaned on the rail, the weight of her decision lightening with every mile the ship pulled away from shore. She felt no tremor of guilt, only the strange serenity of someone who had, for once, chosen herself. Dinner on the ship that evening was a quiet affair. Margaret sat alone at a table by the window, savoring a simple but perfectly prepared salmon with lemon dill. The waiter, a cheerful young man from Lisbon, asked if she was celebrating anything. She thought for a moment. "Yes," she said, smiling, "a new beginning." Afterward, she returned to her cabin and opened her journal. The first page she filled not with descriptions of the ship or the sea, but with memories of Thomas, how he'd held her hand during storms, how he used to whistle when folding laundry, how he'd drawn that map of places they would go someday. "Someday is today," she wrote beneath it. The next morning, she awoke to a flurry of emails in her onboard inbox, messages from extended family, vague and alarmed. "Are you okay? Rachel's wedding venue fell through? What happened?" She deleted each one without reading further. She already knew what happened. By evening, another message came, this time forwarded from her sister June, a blurry photo attached. The replacement venue, a drab conference room at a budget hotel near the airport. Folding chairs, dim lighting. Rachel in her gown, standing in front of a plain curtain backdrop with no altar. Claudia standing stiff beside her, face tight. Margaret stared at the image, not with triumph, but with disbelief. They actually tried to go through with it. The florist hadn't delivered. The caterer canceled. The string quartet backed out. Half the guests didn't get the update in time. The remaining half spent the night murmuring awkwardly over cold pasta in disposable bowls. Rachel had thrown a party with no heartbeat, a celebration built on exclusion and convenience, and the universe had mirrored that emptiness right back at her. Margaret didn't feel vindicated. She felt mournful. This wasn't what she had wanted. Not failure, not humiliation, just a matter. And still, even in her absence, her fingerprints were everywhere. Every missing element had once rested in her capable hands, and without her, the whole thing collapsed. She turned off the screen and looked out at the stars scattered across the water. There was nothing left to do but sail forward. The following morning brought calm seas and a warm breeze. Margaret wrapped herself in a light shawl and stepped onto the balcony with her coffee. The scent of salt and sun filled the air. In the distance, the silhouette of Lisbon began to rise from the horizon, soft and golden in the early light. She felt no urge to check her phone. Instead, she opened her travel journal again. The page before her held a half-written memory about Rachel's fifth-grade science fair, how they stayed up late building a papier-mâché volcano, how Margaret had nearly burned the kitchen experimenting with lava mixtures, how Rachel's face lit up when the thing erupted just right. Margaret smiled. She had always shown up. Not perfectly, not always gracefully, but fully. And now she was showing up again. For herself. Disembarking in Lisbon was like walking into a dream. Cobblestone streets, pastel buildings, azulejo tiles glimmering in the sun. She wandered through alleyways, sipped espresso at a cafe, and let her feet carry her nowhere in particular. For the first time in decades, she wasn't moving for anyone else's schedule. Later that afternoon, she visited the Geronimos Monastery, marveling at its arches and shadows, the way light played against stone like water over rock. She stood quietly in the nave and whispered a soft, "Thank you," to Thomas, not for anything specific, just for the love that had shaped her. The next evening brought the first of the guest dinners, assigned seating, strangers brought together by chance. Margaret was paired with a retired journalist named Irene and a couple celebrating their 40th anniversary. They talked about books, travel, the strange joy of starting over. No one asked why she was alone. No one pitied her. She was just Margaret, a woman with a suitcase, a passport, and a plan. She returned to her cabin with a lightness in her chest she hadn't known she was missing. Not happiness, exactly. Something deeper. peace. On the desk, the ship's daily bulletin awaited her. Next stop, Barcelona. Flamenco show optional tour. She signed up immediately, and as she tucked herself into bed, she realized something. Rachel hadn't just uninvited her from a wedding. She had unknowingly freed her from a role Margaret no longer needed to perform. She wasn't just the mother left out. She was the woman moving on. Barcelona buzzed with life. Street performers filled the plazas, their music winding through the alleys like incense. Margaret wandered through La Rambla, sampled olives from market stalls, and marveled at Gaudi's wild genius at Sagrada Familia. She filled pages of her travel journal with impressions, sketches, snippets of overheard conversations, each entry a thread in the tapestry of her rediscovered self. But it wasn't until she returned to her cabin late one evening, cheeks flushed from wine and laughter, that she found the letter. It wasn't in her inbox. It wasn't a text. It was real. Paper, ink, an envelope, delivered by the ship's concierge with a note that it had been forwarded to the next port. Her heart caught in her throat as she saw the handwriting. Rachel's. She stared at it for a long time before opening it. Part of her feared blame. Another part feared apology. But most of all, she feared the attempt to pull her back into a place she had fought hard to leave. Still, she unfolded the page. Dear Mom, I don't know how to begin this without sounding like I'm making excuses. I'm not. I just want to explain what happened, not to justify it, but because I think you deserve to hear it. When we told you not to come to the wedding, it wasn't because we didn't love you. I know how that sounds. I know how empty it must have felt. It was Mark's idea originally. He thought it would be better to avoid any clashes with his family. Claudia supported it, of course, and I went along with it because it seemed easier. Margaret stopped reading there, her eyes burning. Easier? She thought bitterly. Exiling your mother from your wedding was easier? She set the letter down and stepped out onto the balcony, the salt wind hitting her like truth. But she couldn't bring herself to throw the letter away. She returned to it after a long silence, sitting cross-legged on the bed. I didn't realize how much you'd done until it all started falling apart. The venue, the vendors, everything unraveled so fast and we couldn't fix it. We ended up in a hotel ballroom that smelled like bleach. The flowers never came. Half the guests didn't show. I spent my wedding day pretending it was enough. It wasn't. You were the glue, Mom. I thought I could replace you with convenience and elegance, but I replaced love with obligation, and it showed. Margaret blinked hard, her breath shallow. The letter wasn't finished, but something inside her already had begun to close, or perhaps open. Margaret reread the letter in the quiet of her cabin, the words folding around her heart like a bittersweet balm. Rachel's handwriting, familiar yet distant, seemed to carry a weight that neither of them had spoken aloud. She imagined Rachel, dressed in the ill-fitted gown, standing before guests who whispered questions and doubts. She pictured Claudia's sharp eyes narrowing in judgment, the cold absence of warmth that no amount of floral arrangements could mask. The apology was there, raw and honest, but it was also an admission of failure. Failure to protect, failure to honor, failure to understand. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in the journal beside her bed. She traced the edge with a finger and thought about what it meant to forgive, not just Rachel, but herself. For years, she had carried the burden of unspoken blame, the silent belief that if only she had done more, said more, been more, things might have been different. Now she saw that love was not a ledger balanced by effort. It was something deeper, messier, and sometimes heartbreaking. She took a deep breath and reached for her phone, hesitating before unlocking it. There were messages, some from old friends, a few from family members, none from Rachel. She didn't reply. Instead, she opened her travel app and booked a flamenco dance class for the following week, a small act of rebellion and joy. Later that evening, as the ship sailed into the moonlight, Margaret sat on the deck wrapped in a blanket, watching stars ripple across the water. She whispered a quiet promise, not to Rachel, not to anyone, but to herself, to live fully, freely, and without regret, The past was a story told. The future was hers to write. Days passed, and the cruise ship glided steadily through the Mediterranean, visiting ports rich with history and color. Margaret found herself captivated by each new city, its sounds, smells, and stories weaving into the fabric of her own journey. But the letter from Rachel lingered in her thoughts like a quiet echo. She began writing in her travel journal, not about the places she'd seen, but about the mother she had been and the daughter she had loved. She wrote of the years spent sewing costumes for school plays, attending every recital, wiping tears after heartbreaks. She wrote of patience tested by silence, of sacrifices made without acknowledgement, and of love that persisted despite growing distance. One afternoon, as the ship docked in Venice, Margaret attended a small art gallery opening with Irene, the retired journalist she had met on board. Over glasses of wine, they spoke of reinvention and resilience. "You know," Irene said, "we often think forgiveness means forgetting, but sometimes it just means freeing ourselves." Margaret nodded slowly. The word forgiveness had felt heavy, like a demand placed on her by others. But here, surrounded by strangers and the vastness of the sea, she began to see it as a gift, one she could give herself first. That evening, in her cabin, Margaret penned a response, not to send, but to release. "Dear Rachel, thank you for your honesty. It hurts, but I needed to hear it. I hope you find peace in the choices you've made. As for me, I am learning to find peace in letting go." She closed the journal and placed it on the bedside table. Outside, the sky was a deep navy, the stars gleaming like scattered diamonds. Margaret felt a quiet strength settling within her, a promise that whatever came next, she would meet it with grace. The following day, as the ship sailed toward the Italian coast, Margaret received an unexpected message on her phone. It was from an unknown number, and for a moment she hesitated before opening it. "Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that Claudia has been exposed. Someone leaked the forged check to the press. The wedding chaos wasn't just bad luck, it was worse. I'm so sorry for everything." Margaret stared at the message, the words sinking in slowly like pebbles dropped into still water, sending ripples across her calm surface. For years, Claudia's influence had been a silent force, a shadow looming over Rachel's choices, pushing her to sever ties with Margaret to protect the family image. Now that shadow was breaking apart. Margaret didn't reply immediately. She folded her phone away and looked out at the sea, the horizon vast and endless. She wasn't sure what she felt. Relief, sadness, vindication, all mingled in a complicated knot. But she did know one thing. No matter what happened on shore, her journey was hers to continue. Later that evening, at a shipboard gathering, Margaret raised her glass with newfound friends to the future, a future unshackled by resentment, full of possibility. She realized that the real victory wasn't in exposing the lies or in Rachel's apologies. It was in reclaiming her own story. And as the stars shone brightly above, Margaret smiled for the first time in a long while. She was free. The gentle rocking of the ship beneath her feet was soothing, a rhythmic lullaby that accompanied Margaret's newfound sense of calm. The world had shifted beneath her, and though the past still lingered in the corners of her mind, she no longer felt tethered to its weight. Each morning she woke with the sun, pulling back the curtains to reveal vast blue skies and endless waves. The days unfolded slowly, filled with moments of quiet reflection and unexpected joy. She discovered a small library on board where she lost herself in stories of far-off lands and fearless women. She joined art classes, brushing pastel strokes across canvases and marveling at the colors she hadn't seen since childhood. She learned to navigate new technology, sending postcards home to friends she'd never met. One afternoon, as the ship glided through the turquoise waters of the Mediterranean, Margaret found herself on the deck watching a group of dancers rehearsing for the evening's show. Their movements were fluid, joyful, a celebration of life in motion. Something stirred within her. She decided to join the flamenco workshop offered the following week, a bold choice for someone who had spent decades blending into the background. That evening, she penned a note in her journal. "Today I chose to step forward, to dance, to live." Her heart fluttered with nervous excitement, but it was a good kind of fear, the kind that signals growth. Margaret was no longer the woman who had quietly borne her burdens. She was becoming someone new. The flamenco class was nothing like Margaret expected. The studio was warm, wooden floors gleaming under soft lights. The instructor, a passionate woman named Lucia, moved with fierce grace, encouraging every participant to find their own rhythm. Margaret felt awkward at first, her feet stiff and unfamiliar with the sharp staccato movements. But as the music swelled and the clapping grew louder, something inside her unfurled. With each stomp, turn, and snap of her fingers, she shed layers of doubt and years of silence. She laughed when she stumbled, encouraged by the friendly smiles of fellow dancers, most decades younger, but equally eager. Lucia pulled Margaret aside during a break. "You have spirit," she said, eyes bright. "Not many find flamenco at this stage and embrace it like you do." Margaret smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "It's never too late to start." That night, back in her cabin, she traced her fingers over the journal, now filling with sketches, travel notes, and small treasures like pressed flowers and ticket stubs. She wrote of the dance, of freedom and rediscovery. The days turned into weeks. The ship became her moving home, the people on board her new community. Conversations sparked over shared dinners. Laughter echoed in hallways, and stories were exchanged beneath starlit skies. Margaret found herself sharing parts of her past cautiously, testing the waters. The pain of Rachel's rejection was still there, but now it was tempered by resilience. She realized that this journey was not just about seeing new places, but about reclaiming her voice. And in the quiet rhythms of flamenco, she was learning to speak again. The cruise ship made its way toward the Indian Ocean, and Margaret's days took on a rhythm that felt both foreign and comforting. Mornings began with sunlit stretches on the deck, afternoons with explorations of bustling ports, evenings with quiet reflections beneath a blanket of stars. In the bustling markets of Marrakesh, she bartered for spices and hand-woven scarves, her fingers tracing textures that spoke of centuries. In Kerala, she rowed a houseboat through winding canals, the scent of jasmine and cardamom mingling in the humid air. Each place was a new chapter, a fresh page in the book of her life. One evening, while sharing a meal with fellow travelers, Margaret listened to stories of lost loves, second chances, and the courage to start over. She realized she wasn't alone in her journey. Every person carried scars, hidden struggles, and dreams waiting to be fulfilled. The dance lessons continued. Margaret found herself moving with more confidence, her body attuned to the music's pulse. It was more than just a class. It was a declaration of self-worth, a reclaiming of joy. She journaled daily, her entries growing more candid and hopeful. She wrote about forgiveness, not just for Rachel, but for herself. About the grace found in letting go, about the thrill of becoming whole again. Margaret had traded the suffocating expectations of a life half-lived for the boundless possibilities of the open sea. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, she smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in what felt like forever. As the ship sailed further into the vastness of the Pacific, Margaret found herself reflecting on the life she had left behind and the one she was now creating. The worries and pain that once consumed her now felt like distant echoes, softened by the endless horizon and the steady rhythm of the waves. One morning, she attended a lecture on ancient cultures in the ship's lounge. The speaker's words about resilience and transformation resonated deeply. Margaret thought about the years she had spent shaping her daughter's life, the sacrifices made in silence, and the painful lesson of being cast aside. But more than that, she embraced the idea that endings were also beginnings, that pain could birth strength, and loss could create space for growth. Later, in the ship's garden courtyard, Margaret struck up a conversation with a fellow traveler, Elena, a widow who had embarked on her own journey of rediscovery. They shared stories of love and loss, laughter and tears, finding kinship in their shared experiences. Margaret realized she was no longer alone. She was part of a community of women who refused to be defined by past hurts or societal expectations. That evening, under a sky full of stars, Margaret stood on the deck, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She thought about Rachel, about forgiveness, about the future she was forging with each step forward. She whispered to the night, "I am enough." And in that moment, Margaret knew she was free. Back on land, the aftermath of the wedding unfolded like a storm. The news spread quickly, through whispered conversations at family gatherings, through social media murmurs, and through the disappointed voices of guests who had anticipated a grand celebration. Rachel's carefully curated world was unraveling. The venue loss, the last-minute scramble to relocate, the lack of catering and decorations. It became a topic of quiet gossip and sharp judgment. Claudia, usually the unshakable matriarch, was seen pacing nervously behind closed doors, her composed facade cracking under pressure. Reports surfaced that the final payment for Northgate Manor had never arrived, and suspicions began to swirl. The truth, once buried beneath layers of privilege and expectation, started to seep out. Rachel found herself isolated. The invitations she had sent out with such care seemed meaningless now. Friends distanced themselves, unsure whether to offer sympathy or judgment. The pressures of public embarrassment weighed heavily, and with each passing day, the facade of perfection faded. Meanwhile, Margaret remained on the ship, receiving distant updates through occasional emails from relatives. She read with a quiet detachment, the storm raging far away from her new world. She realized that Rachel's loss was not merely a failed event, but a profound lesson in what truly matters. For the first time, Margaret understood that love and respect could not be purchased or staged. They were earned, nurtured, and reciprocated. As the ship sailed toward new horizons, Margaret looked out over the dark water, the stars shimmering above, and felt a deep, abiding peace. She was no longer a footnote in someone else's story. She was the author of her own. Back home, the fallout from the wedding debacle rippled through the Langley family like a relentless storm. Claudia's usual poise faltered in private conversations with her social circle, where whispers of scandal threatened to tarnish the family name. The carefully maintained image she had fought so hard to cultivate was now cracking at the edges, exposing vulnerabilities she had long denied. Rachel, caught in the eye of the storm, faced a painful reckoning. Invitations she had painstakingly sent out were met with polite declines or silence. The guests who did attend were subdued, their enthusiasm dampened by the last-minute changes and visible tension. The echo of empty chairs at the reception was a stark reminder of what had been lost. In a quiet moment, alone, Rachel found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone. Snapshots of childhood birthdays, family vacations, candid smiles captured in fleeting moments of joy. One picture stood out, a young Margaret holding a proud, beaming Rachel on her lap. The warmth of that memory contrasted sharply with the cold reality of recent days. With tears in her eyes, Rachel composed an email to her mother. The words were simple, but heavy with meaning. "Mom, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I miss you." Margaret received the message while watching a sunset from the deck of the ship, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. She read the words slowly, feeling a complex mix of emotions, sorrow, relief, and cautious hope. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she saved the message, a silent acknowledgement of the bridge that might one day be rebuilt. For now, Margaret embraced the freedom she had fought so hard to claim, knowing that some wounds required time to heal and some apologies were just the beginning of a longer journey. Days later, Margaret sat quietly in the ship's lounge, the hum of soft conversation around her blending with the gentle sway of the ocean. Her thoughts wandered back to the letter Rachel had sent. Simple, honest, and full of regret. It was a start, fragile but genuine. A knock at her cabin door interrupted her reverie. It was Irene, the journalist who had become a trusted friend on this voyage. "I heard about the message," Irene said gently, sitting beside her. "How are you feeling?" Margaret smiled faintly. "It's complicated. Forgiveness is a long road, isn't it?" Irene nodded. "It is, but it's also a gift, to yourself as much as to them." Together, they shared stories of past hurts and newfound hope, the connection between them a balm to old wounds. That evening, Margaret stood on the deck, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was a canvas of colors, fiery reds melting into deep purples. It was beautiful, wild, and free. She thought of Rachel, of Claudia, of the life she had left behind. There was sadness, yes, but also acceptance. Margaret realized that love, real love, was not about control or appearances. It was about truth, vulnerability, and the courage to let go. She felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. As the ship sailed onward, Margaret embraced the unknown with open arms, ready for whatever lay ahead. The final night of the cruise was unlike any other. The ship's grand dining room was adorned with twinkling lights, and soft music floated through the air as passengers mingled, sharing stories of adventures and dreams. Margaret sat at a small table near the window, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass as she watched the stars shimmer on the dark sea. She felt a profound sense of closure, not from confrontation or reconciliation, but from the quiet recognition that she had reclaimed her life on her own terms. The journey had been about more than escape. It was about transformation. Her thoughts drifted back to Rachel's email, the apology that had started the fragile mending of their fractured bond. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. Margaret pulled out her journal and wrote one last entry. "To whoever reads this, one day. Life is not measured by the moments others give us, but by the moments we choose to live fully. I have learned that love is a river that sometimes runs wild and sometimes runs dry, but it always finds its way back to the sea. I am grateful for the storms that shaped me, for the quiet nights that healed me, and for the freedom I have found in my own heart." As the night wore on, Margaret stood on the deck, the cool breeze tousling her silver hair. Below, the ocean stretched infinitely, a reminder of both the vastness of the world and the depths within herself. She thought of the years she had spent trying to fit into a role dictated by others, a role of sacrifice, silence, and unacknowledged love. Now she was stepping into a new role, one of self-respect, joy, and possibility. A gentle smile curved her lips. This was not the end. It was a quiet beginning. As the ship sailed toward dawn, Margaret whispered to the wind, "I am ready." And with that, she stepped forward into the next chapter of her life, unbound, unafraid, and truly free.